In a time before video games, in an age of sticks and stones, it was a world without color, when uncivilized blood sport and rudimentary ball games were the hay of their day. Back when a single computer filled an entire room. A time now forgotten, an age now lost, and a world that was changed forever in the wake of a golden age reined in by the adventures of great heroes whose stories are no longer revered. So now I will tell you the tale of the dawn of video games. Our story begins with these purely mechanical ball games, known as bagatelle, which have been around since at least the 1600s. And this one from the 1700s even has a spring mechanism to launch the ball with. These began as table versions of various garden games, like bowling and good old stickball. But the plot thickens in 1931 when these bad boys became coin-operated. The very first of these was this one called Baffle Ball. It was designed by a Mr. David Gottlieb, and the goal of the game is to fire the balls with the right amount of strength, to land them in the score zones, and there's a special spot at the top called the baffle point, which doubles your score. A novel idea, but incentivizing players with cash prizes for top scores made these a smash hit, especially during the Great Depression. Following his great success with Baffle Ball, our guy doubled down by designing an even more luck-based game, this time with a card gambling theme, called the Playboy. This is how they got it twisted in the 30s, when you're 25 cents in the hole because that's all you're worth, and dropping your last nickel means you ain't gonna eat for a whole week. These bad boys were originally known as marble games, or pin games, and the iconic name of pinball that we use today is, of course, literally derived from the pins and balls of the game. Now, you still had to tally up your score the old-fashioned way on these early models, but all that would soon change as these games would go electric. At first, they keep the score with light bulbs, and then some later ones used these number reels, which surprisingly were less popular. Also around this time in '36, Bally made a historically important game that nobody remembers called Bumper, which revolutionized pinball by replacing the pins with bumpers. Pinball rapidly became more and more exciting as more and more manufacturers were bringing fancier and fancier machines, with more lights, mechanical animations, and sexy art. As we all know, there's one thing that sells better than hotcakes, and it's hot cake. The vast majority of all pinball games for the next 20 years or so would feature the art from the same two legends, Roy Parker and George Melenton. Pinball was popular, but it was becoming a problem, as it was just basically gambling, and all the gangbangers were running their own pinball games. And aside from the gambling, they would also use them to launder money, by essentially using them as piggy banks for all their ill-gotten coin, like from those old-school protection rackets, and all the other unethical monetization strategies that now bring massive success to mobile games, and places like Chuck E. Cheese. Alright, little Johnny, it's your birthday. Time to pay the mouse. And just like Chuck E. Cheese, pinball was shaking down kids of the 30s for all they're worth. So pinball had become a prominent symbol of corruption. And to further exacerbate pinball's bad reputation, the vast majority of pinball games were manufactured in Chicago, which was one of the worst places for organized crime all throughout the Great Depression. And at the turn of the decade, the disgust and hatred for pinball was mounting. Law officials were after it for its gambling and mafia connections, while church ladies saw pinball as a gateway to juvenile delinquency. And in '42, the mayor of New York City, Fiorello LaGuardia, convinced the city council to finally ban pinball from their city once and for all. every machine in sight was confiscated, and anyone found to be operating one was arrested. Police squads raided every bar, every bowling alley, and every candy store in the city. All the rounded up machines were smashed to bits, and then loaded onto garbage barges to be dumped out at sea. Some 2,000 or so total machines were destroyed, of the estimated 10,000 that were believed to be in the city. Many other cities would soon follow suit, and pinball would go underground, becoming an icon of rebels and counterculture. Pinball would continue to evolve in parts of America where it was still legal, and one very important innovation came in 1947, when flippers were introduced with this Humpty Dumpty game. Now this was a big deal, because it actually made pinball into a game of skill, or at least gave it one more step of gameplay, kind of like running rifts in Diablo Immortal. Now these first games to get the new patch put those boys in there rather precariously, because you already know what it is, and places were still handing out prizes for top scores. One of the most popular methods was that machines would have ways to win free games, but they'd be very difficult and very luck-based to achieve. There'd be lights on the machine somewhere to track how many you've earned, and game owners would let you cash in the quote-unquote free games for cash prizes. To circumvent this practice, some places outlawed the ability to win free games without banning pinball entirely. And pinball machines would often come with optional stickers for game owners to cover up the free game lights. In '51, someone finally got the flippers right, and Niagara would be the first pinball machine of this style. However, for now, pinball remained notorious, and while adding flippers may have prevented pinball from being banned in some areas, it wasn't enough to save it in regions where it was already outlawed. Only a decade prior, in 1941, the very first programmable computer would switch on. The Z3, which was designed and developed by a Mr. Conrad Zuse. Now this machine, although it was digital, was also still electromechanical. Program code could be stored on punched film or typed in from the keyboard, and data could be stored in up to 64 words of memory. You see, in the early days of computers, memory was calculated in words instead of bits. A word of memory typically refers to a group of bits that a computer can access simultaneously, and depending on the device, a single word can be 16 bits, 32 bits, or 64 bits. Now around this time, a word of memory was typically somewhere between 12 and 40 bits. It's the old computer equivalent of measuring in feet and qubits. Purely electronic circuits would soon replace their mechanical and electromechanical predecessors. A Mr. John Vincent Atanasoff and Clifford E. Berry of Iowa State University together developed and tested the Atanasoff-Berry computer only a year later in 1942. And this was the world's first fully automatic electronic digital computer. It used about 300 vacuum tubes with capacitors fixed in a mechanically rotating drum to create memory. Computers would continue to get bigger and better, like the Colossus from '44, which is made up of 1,500 valves. And the workaround for memory this time came on this 5-hole punch tape. And this machine slurps those strips up at 30 miles an hour, while being able to read up to about 2,000 characters a second. What an absolute beast! It was developed by British codebreakers, namely a telephone engineer named Tommy Flowers, in order to crack Germany's Lorenz cipher during World War II. Britain was leading the charge on computer development, as in the same year, at the University of Manchester, they would begin developing what they called the Manchester Baby. After 4 long years of development, it became operational in '48, finally showing the world a device which could run a stored program. It wasn't a full computer though, but just a year later, they would build another very important machine, which was the Electronic Delay Storage Automatic Calculator, or the EDSAC for short. It was built by Sir Maurice Vincent Wilkes and his team at the University of Cambridge Mathematical Laboratory. This bad boy was stacked with over 1,000 memory locations, 1,024 to be precise, although only half of them were initially installed. Each memory location contains about 18 bits, but the topmost bit was always unavailable due to timing issues, so only 17 bits of each location were actually used. Programs came in the form of a 5-bit instruction code, using one spare bit, a 10-bit operand, which is a value or expression that is manipulated by a mathematical operator, such as plus, minus, divide, or multiply. And this 10-bit operand was usually for a memory address. It also uses another 1-bit to control whether the instruction would use a 17-bit or 35-bit operand. Now, a soon-to-be legend was studying at Cambridge, Alexander Shafto Douglas. And you know he's the real deal because he also went by his gamer tag, Sandy, and he would also go by that name professionally, even later becoming known as Professor Sandy Douglas. Now in '52, while working towards his PhD, he wrote a thesis about human-computer interactions, and he needed an example to prove his theories. And conveniently, Cambridge just so happened to house the second storable program computer. With access to the EDSAC, he programmed the code for a simple tic-tac-toe game, where a player can play against the computer. Originally known as Noughts and Crosses, and later renamed as OXO when historian Martin Campbell Kelly created a simulation of the EDSAC and this game several decades later. The EDSAC had 3 small cathode ray tube screens for displaying the state of memory, and Sandy repurposed one of them to display the game. The program's artificial intelligence would essentially play a perfect game of tic-tac-toe, and the player would input their moves using a rotary telephone controller by selecting which of the 9 squares on the board they wished to move next. And the display would update along with the state of the game almost immediately. Now there is another contender for the world's very first computer video game, as there was a second game which was operational around the same time, and it's unclear as to which actually came first, because another British computer wizard, a Mr. Christopher Strachey, wrote a checkers program for the Pilot Ace computer, or the Automatic Computing Engine. However, the Pilot Ace couldn't handle the game, and completely exhausted the Ace's memory. But he then moved his program to the Manchester Mark I, which was the successor of the Manchester Baby, back at the University of Manchester. The Mark I had a much bigger memory. The game was displayed on a good old CRT, which stands for Cathode Ray Tube. It's essentially a vacuum tube with electron beams that get manipulated in order to display images on a phosphorescent screen. And the term cathode ray was coined to describe electron beams when they were first discovered, before it was understood that what was emitted from the cathode was actually a beam of electrons. Mr. Strachey also programmed the first music to ever be played by a computer, and it was done on the same Manchester Mark I computer. It was a rendition of the British national anthem, God Save the King. In '53, the University of Michigan finished developing the Michigan Digital Automatic Computer, or the MIDAC for short. And just a year later in '54, they programmed it to play craps, because you already know what it is. In this Chicago Tribune article, It says that the machine would continue to roll the imaginary dice until somebody won, and the results of each roll were printed out on a continuous sheet of paper. And then they also programmed the MIDAC with a tic-tac-toe game, but without the CRT. However, they built a more advanced MIDSAC computer, or the Michigan Digital Special Automatic Computer, which actually was connected to a CRT. And what I think is really cool is that they hosted a billiards pool game on it, with a full rack of 15 balls. So you had an analog joystick that you could use to move the cue stick around the table, and a rotational knob controlled the angle of the shot, which was then triggered by pressing a button. However, that joystick which positioned the cue stick was only a graphical thing, and that rotational knob for the angle of your shot was the only relevant control for the computational input of the game. The game was developed for the sole purpose of a single demonstration in June of '54, and the pool simulation was chosen for its similarities to the guidance problems that they were solving with it, which were the MIDSAC's true but classified purpose at the time. Now, these are the first known computer games with screens displaying any kind of graphics. However, just a year prior, we have a couple of really neat but lesser known computer games. In 1950, a vacuum tube manufacturer named Rogers Majestic financed a custom-built computer to impress the public as a novelty and showcase the potential of future computer technology. What started as a Canadian electronic computer research project from the University of Toronto became something far more interesting when a Mr. Joseph Cates devised a device he called the Additron, which was an electron tube that was smaller, less complex, and less power-hungry than the typical vacuum tubes of the day. But while perhaps revolutionary, the Additron never found its way into the university's computer project, and it never had a chance to see commercial production either, because by the time it had passed the very long and very painful patent process, which didn't conclude until 6 years later, in 1956, the technology had already become obsolete. To promote this technology during its delay, Cates created a tic-tac-toe game named Bertie the Brain. It was unveiled at the Canadian National Exhibition in the summer of 1950. The machine was over 13 feet tall, and it ran on a custom-built computer, and the player would input their moves on a lit keypad. Naturally, the machine always plays a perfect game, but it came with a difficulty setting that would have it play a less optimal game for children. And then Bertie the Brain was sadly dismantled after its one and only show. Just a year later, another custom-built computer, this time from the British engineering firm Ferranti, was also unveiled for the sole purpose of public amusement. The Nimrod is a computer that plays a game of Nim with an artificial intelligence. It was displayed at the 1951 Festival of Britain, which is a national exhibition that promotes British contributions to many things, but is mostly centered around things like science, technology, industrial design, architecture, and the arts. Now, the Nimrod was another hulking machine, designed by a Mr. John Bennett. Nim is an ancient game that comes in many forms, but the gist of it is that players take turns removing objects from a pile or piles, with the goal being to either take the last object or to avoid taking the last object. Players would input their moves on a raised panel with buttons corresponding to lights on the machine. The Nimrod would of course take its turn immediately after, but something special about the Nimrod is that it was more designed to demonstrate the company's computer design, and observers could see Nimrod's calculations in real time, as they were represented with a number of lights, and the calculation speed could also be slowed down to give people more of a show. The Nimrod digital computer was advertised as faster than thought and as an electronic brain. It could play both the standard game as well as the reverse version, and hilariously, onlookers were far more interested in playing and trying to beat the game than in the demonstration of the technology. And just like Birdie the Brain, after having served its purpose, Nimrod was dismantled. There was also another NIM playing machine from an entire decade earlier, but unlike Nimrod, which was a fully programmable computer, this bad boy, called the Nimitron, was an electromechanical machine. It was first exhibited in 1940 by the Westinghouse Electric Corporation at the New York World's Fair. It was invented by the American physicist Edward Condon. It was composed of electromechanical relays, which could respond to players' choices, with a dozen or so different patterns. Rows of lights in a cube above the machine represented the game state, and the Nimitron's calculations were purposefully delayed to give the illusion that the machine was considering moves. And anyone who was able to beat the machine was awarded with one of these special tokens. Now that would be a very rare prize to have today. Sometime around 1952, the RAND Corporation, short for Research and Development, started making computerized military simulation games. RAND employed many great mathematicians and scientists across a wide array of disciplines, and contributed to numerous breakthroughs in all sorts of stuff, but especially artificial intelligence and in networking. Upon RAND's formation, its electronics division was mostly focused on the Air Force's Air Force Defense System, a network of radar stations that would feed data on incoming aircraft to a series of air defense direction centers, where personnel could compile data and evaluate threats. With the growing potential of the Cold War going hot, advancements in this technology were becoming ever more invaluable. The Army would soon follow suit with their very own Operations Research Office, also known as the ORO. In 1955, with the help from Johns Hopkins University, the researchers at ORO created a computer war game called Hutspiel. It was a simulation played by two people, each assuming the role of either NATO or the Soviet-Russian forces, as a study for the use of tactical nuclear weapons and air support throughout Western Europe in case of a Soviet invasion. At the start of the game, each player allocates his forces across the areas he controlled, and then chooses targets for his planes and nukes, which could be enemy troops, airfields, supply depots, or any other facilities, and then the computer would determine the results. In the original version of the game, the simulation would just play out till the end on its own, but it could be paused at any time for a player to issue new orders. But later versions of the game were set up with turns of fixed time increments. Swinging back around to the RAND Corporation, they developed a pen and paper simulation called Monoplogs, where players would learn the principles of logistics by running a portion of the Air Force supply system. And in '56, they built a new logistics systems laboratory to create computer simulations to train their logistics personnel. Supposedly, this monoplog simulation inspired the American Management Association to assemble a team with people from both RAND and IBM to create a business management simulation called the Top Management Decision Simulation, which was programmed on an IBM 650 and released commercially in '57. Just a year later in '58, an American physicist, William Higginbotham, designed a game for display at the Brookhaven National Laboratory's annual public exhibition, known as Tennis for Two or Computer Tennis. The game is displayed on an oscilloscope and played with two custom aluminum controllers. It's supposed to look like a tennis court viewed from the side, and players can adjust the angle of their shots by turning a knob on their controller and try to hit the ball back by pressing a button. Computer tennis proved to be very popular during the event, so they brought it back the following year with a larger display and some additional features, like being able to change the gravity levels. The original computer tennis game was discontinued after the second year's event, but some years later, Brookhaven reconstructed it. Tennis for Two is often celebrated as the first video game, which was created purely for entertainment, and not as some kind of commercial promotion or research project. In '61, we see a text-based baseball simulator game run on the IBM 1620. You feed a hole punch tape into this computer to give it information, and you can give the game whatever player stats you want to play around a fantasy baseball, and then the computer prints out the results of the game onto one of those continuous sheets of paper. Using an oscilloscope as a computer monitor started to become a more and more common idea. The Laboratory Instrument Computer, or the LINC for short, is one of the first computers to have an oscilloscope used as a dedicated monitor. And just look at that guy. That's not even half of the machine. That entire refrigerator-sized box on the right is the other half of it. All that gear, and all you get with it is that little itty-bitty screen. Now, one very special computer, the Programmed Data Processor 1, or the PDP-1, came together with a CRT monitor. The company developing this fresh new machine, the Digital Equipment Corporation, was looking for a cool way to demonstrate their hot new tech. And in '62, they assembled a trio of wizards from MIT to create something truly magical. Martin Graetz, a research assistant and former student at MIT, Wayne Wittinen, a research assistant at Harvard and former employee and student of MIT, and Steve Russell, an American computer scientist who also goes by Slug, another good old boy with a tag. That's how you know he's for real. Now, while developing their new project, Russell took an interview with the Rolling Stone and said, "We had this brand new PDP-1. Somebody had built some little pattern generating programs which made interesting patterns like a kaleidoscope. Not a very good demonstration. Here was this display that could do all sorts of good things. So we started talking about it, figuring what would be interesting displays. We decided that probably you could make a two-dimensional maneuvering sort of thing, and decided that naturally the obvious thing to do was spaceships. And thus, the legendary game known as Space War would eclipse the world over. It's a one-on-one, player versus player dogfight in space, with the goal being to hit the opponent with a torpedo. But precision is key, because they go on cooldown, so you can't just spam them. The edges of the screen also loop back around Pac-Man style, and there's a star in the center of the playfield with the gravitational pull that pulls the ships, but not the missiles. And naturally, colliding with it also destroys you. Now you've got a fire button, and a forward thrust, which has limited fuel, as well as the ability to rotate in either direction, and a special hyperspace button, or the panic button as they also called it, which warps you to a random location. And in some versions of the game, each use of the hyperspace comes with an increasing chance of exploding your ship. Originally, both players controlled the game by using these front panel test switches of the PDP-1. But that was silly and cumbersome, so then they developed proper control panels by creating one of the first gamepads, alongside computer tennis of course, which also had a handheld controller. Space War was popping off at MIT. It was the melee of its day, and people were sharing it around and installing it on any PDP-1 computer in sight. It soon spread to other nearby universities and quickly became a top headline. Space War has gone down as one of the most important and influential games of video game history. It was extremely popular in the small but rapidly growing program communities of the 1960s. And the code of the game was also public domain, so it was very quickly ported to and recreated on any other computer of the day that could run it, especially towards the end of the decade, where it became more and more common for computer systems to have monitors. In 1964, a guy named Bill Nutting was a partner in a company called edX, which had created a coin-operated trivia game called the Knowledge Computer. Bill marketed the machine for edX and then bought the rights to it afterwards. He then founded a company of his own called Nutting Associates to market the Knowledge Computer that he bought. And in '67, he redesigned it and rebranded it as the Computer Quiz. Also in '64, we see the very first educational text-based game known as the Sumerian game. It's a resource management game where you run a kingdom in 3000 BC. Complete with random disasters and technological innovations. It was intended to be played by a classroom of students. You type your commands into a teleprinter, which are all basically just typing in numbers when it asks you questions. And again, all the results are printed out. Now, a teleprinter is an old-style printer which could both send and receive messages, which would be printed out, of course. Sort of like a primitive fax machine. A later version of the game also came with taped audio lectures, which had dramatized discussions of the ruler's court advisors, corresponding with images for a slide projector that would be managed by the teacher. A bunch more copycat text-based games started popping up. There's an uncredited American football one that nobody knows when it was actually made. There's a rip-off of the Sumerian game called the Sumer game. And in 1970, we see a text-based game called High Noon, which is really neat. It simulates a Wild West showdown. You have been challenged to a showdown by Black Bart, one of the meanest desperados west of the Allegheny Mountains. While you are walking down a dusty, deserted street, Black Bart emerges from a saloon, 100 paces away. By agreement, you each have 4 cartridges in your 6 guns. Your marksmanship equals his. At the start of the walk, neither of you can possibly hit the other. And at the end of the walk, neither can miss. The closer you get, the better your chances of hitting Bart, but he also has better chances of hitting you. Do you still want to continue? Yes. Here are your options. Give up, turn tail and run, stand still, or fire. And then you give it a number for a randomly generated roll. Now this is what got him going back in '70. It's great. '71 hits us with the one educational text-based game that just about everybody remembers. You know the one, where you wagon up the old Oregon Trail from Missouri to Oregon City. It's another resource management game, of course, where you have to balance things like food, money, clothes, and bullets to either hunt food or stave off robbers. The game is meant to be hard and reflect the grueling challenge of the difficult journey. You'll be hit with a variety of weather conditions, with countless rivers to get in your way, and you probably don't make it because everyone gets sick eventually. But even if you do make it, that's nothing to celebrate, because the world record is currently 3 minutes and 25 seconds. We need to get Oregon Trail at games done quick. Also in '71, we see a text-based Star Trek strategy game Naturally, you control the Starship Enterprise as you fly through the galaxy to hunt down Klingon warships within a time limit. The galaxy is laid out as an 8x8 grid of quadrants, with each of those broken down into another 8x8 grid of sectors. There are stars and bases for both sides spread all around. What's rather interesting about it is that you've got two kinds of attacks: the phasers and torpedoes. Phasers don't have to be aimed, but their power and damage falls off with distance, and you choose how much power to put behind each shot, which is a resource that you'll have to manage, because movement, combat, and shields all drain your energy, which you can refill by reaching a star base. Torpedoes, however, do not suffer a drop in power with distance, and will destroy an enemy ship with a single hit every time. But the trick is that you have to aim them exactly by typing in coordinates. This is actually a very interesting game, and I love strategy games. The tactics games like Fire Emblem and Langrisser, or Warsong as it was called in America, are my favorite genre actually. I never really enjoyed the more text-based strategy games. I just always thought they were really boring. But after checking this one out, it seems to me that I've just never seen a good one before. There was another Star Trek game that circulated around a year later in '72, made by a guy named Don Daglow, which was very similar, but also included some scripted dialogue for the characters, and other narration to set the mood, and make the experience a bit more immersive. Both of these games were originally meant to be played on one of those teleprinters with the long paper. But if you go and play it on a black screen, it looks really cool. A few years back in '68, Sega released a redesign of their electromechanical periscope arcade game and released it in America, where it became quite popular. And this is the game that popularized the quarter as the cost for coin-operated games. The American version is designed for a single player, but the Japanese version is built for 3 players to play simultaneously. It was originally released as Torpedo Launcher in '65, and was designed by the Nakamura Manufacturing Company, who would later become Namco, and then Sega Enterprises re-released it as Periscope just a year later. The success of this game is referred to as a turning point in the industry and solidified the future of these companies as arcade developers. So the way this game works is that 1 coin gets you 5 torpedoes, and the goal is to shoot down some cardboard cutout ships that move across in the distance. And you look through the view of the periscope to aim your shots, which are animated with lines of colored lights. And the experience is complete with some electronic sound effects. Oh yeah, that's good stuff. Now that legendary Space War game was never sold, as it was just meant to be a demonstrational thing, but the game was so popular and influential that naturally someone would get the bright idea to bring it to market. Half a decade later, in '71, 2 games derivative of it hit the market. Galaxy Game is exactly Space War, but with some extra features, including options for faster ships and torpedoes. You could entirely remove the star and its gravitational field, or reverse the gravity instead to push players away from it, or even remove the wraparound effect and make the edges of the screen a boundary. The movement of the ships comes now consolidated onto a single joystick, with the torpedoes, hyperspace, and bonus game options to be controlled by a panel of buttons. It came in this lovely blue cabinet, and it was meant to be sat in front of with a pair of chairs. You could either get 1 game for a dime or 3 for a quarter. It was built by a pair of guys, Bill Pitts and Hugh Tuck, and it ran on the more modern PDP-11 minicomputer. They were actually just going to call it Space War, but changed the name to Galaxy Game because of the growing anti-war sentiment of the time. Our boys spent a small fortune of about $20,000 to build their prototype, and the game was sadly never mass-produced. Now keep in mind that inflation has almost 10x'd since then, so that $20,000 is something like $200,000 in today's money. It was installed at the Tresidder Union Coffee House at Stanford University, where it was quite popular, and so it remained until '79, when the display processor had worn out and become unreliable. So it was then dismantled, but would later be restored in '97, and is currently held at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California. But another game, known as Computer Space, actually did reach the mass market. It was created by a pair of electrical engineers, Ted Dabney and Nolan Bushnell, who formed a partnership called Syzygy. Similar to Galaxy Game, they designed their game to be a coin-operated version of Space War. Now, computers were still incredibly expensive in the 70s, and it was one of the biggest reasons as to why Galaxy Game could never reach mass production. So rather than running the game on a computer, they instead replaced the central computer with custom-designed hardware that was just strong enough to run the game. They were still developing their proof of concept when Bushnell had found a company that would manufacture their game. And wouldn't you know, it's good old Nutting Associates. In August of '71, the game was ready for show. They ran a test launch only months before Galaxy Game went online, making Computer Space the very first commercially available arcade game. As opposed to Galaxy Game and Space War, Computer Space comes as a single-player game, but it's still trying to do the dogfight in space thing. This time, you battle against an odd pair of alien saucers, with the goal being to outscore them. A point is earned for either side when their enemy is destroyed. There's a clock that counts up to 99, at which point the game will end, unless the player has more points than the AI, in which case the game will restart, again and again until the player loses. And that's the whole game. It's a far less inspired version of Space War. There's no gravity-pulling star, there's no hyperspace. It's kind of lame, actually. And the control scheme looks like, well, not very appealing. But the cabinet that it came in is sexy futuristic. It's so sleek and stylish. One quirk about it, though, is that rotating your ship will also move your missile around as it's projecting. Nutting was excited with the new game and anticipated it to be a big hit, so they produced an initial 1,500 units. And the game was successful enough, selling just over 1,000 of them over its first year. But it wasn't nearly the hit game that they were hoping for. Nutting Associates would go on to manufacture a two-player version of Computer Space, with a more ergonomical joystick control scheme. But our star players, Ted Dabney and Nolan Bushnell, left Nutting Associates and Computer Space behind to forge a new destiny. Ralph Baer was an engineer who had worked for the military contractor Laurel Electronics. And one day, while building a television set, he started pondering an idea about a television that could perform controllable operations, in addition to also receiving and displaying the signals. He brewed on this idea for almost 15 years, and in '66, he eventually fully developed that idea as a television which could play games. He wrote up a 4-page proposal for a game box that would plug into a television screen, costing around $25, which is of course about $250 in today's money. His imagined device would transmit a signal to the TV, which it could tune into like a channel, that he called Channel LP, for Let's Play. He described several games that might be played on it. And at this point in the story, the vast majority of electronic computer games were largely inaccessible to the general public. No commercial video games had ever existed, and there were none that had ever been played on a television set. Now, Bear was currently working for another military contractor called Sanders Associates. Rather than present the idea to any of his bosses, for the time being, he decided to keep his new project a secret. He commandeered an empty room and assigned one of his technicians, a Mr. Bob Tremblay, to work with him on it. By the end of that year, in December of '66, the pair had completed an initial prototype called the TV Game 1, which could both display and control the movement of a single vertical line on a TV screen. Bear then demonstrated his prototype to the Sanders Director of Research and Development, a Mr. Herbert Campman, who hesitantly agreed to fund it. Our boys got straight to work designing more prototypes, and Bear brought in another technician, a Mr. Bill Harrison, to help with the builds. Bear started drawing up game ideas with another engineer, Bill Rush. Bear demonstrated a new prototype with multiple games ready to show his director, who very much enjoyed a shooting game where you used a plastic light gun fashioned as a rifle to shoot targets. The director's enjoyment led to increased funding, and he recommended Bear demonstrate the project to their senior management. So he then demonstrated the console to the entire board of directors, who were largely uninterested, but a few of the guys thought the game box was exciting, and the CEO, Royden Sanders, authorized the project to be continued, with the hope to sell or license it as a commercial product. By August of that year, the boys had a more complete prototype ready, but the $25 price that Bear had originally envisioned wasn't going to be enough for the complete experience they were trying to deliver. Now, Mr. Rush was difficult to work with, but he was really good at programming the games, and so far at this point, it was only possible for the console to display 2 dots at a time, one for each player to control. But this man became a legend when he found a way to display a 3rd dot, which could be controlled by the console itself. And now they've got actual gameplay. They built 3 types of controllers: a joystick controller for a chasing game, sort of like a game of tag, the rifle for a shooting game, and one of these knobby boys for a ping-pong style game. At this point, the director felt that the system was advanced enough to show manufacturers. They decided to sell the rights to produce the console, as Sanders Associates was a military contractor and wasn't in the business of selling commercial electronics. A couple of long years and an economic downturn made it difficult to find a buyer, but in the meantime, they kept improving their design, up to the 7th prototype, now called the Brown Box, featuring those ever-so-stylish wood-grain stickers over the casing. With their system basically complete, they started filing patents for it. They showed it to lots and lots of companies, but no one was quite ready to manufacture something like this. RCA had expressed interest, but after much deliberation, the two groups could not agree on a deal. Not too much longer, an executive from RCA, a Mr. Bill Enders, left RCA to work at Magnavox, and convinced the company to have another look at this game box, which they had already turned down. Most of the executives were still very uninterested, but their vice president of products planning, a Mr. Gary Martin, was all about it. After another 2 years of off-and-on negotiations, in January of '71, Magnavox finally agreed to produce the console. A team from Magnavox, led by a Mr. George Kent, converted the prototype console into its final product. The prototype originally had the ability to display color, and this was the first thing to be cut, because color televisions were still very much a luxury. and the ability to show color would have added additional expense, and the company would also have to deal with additional FCC testing and regulations. They then worked out a single 3-dial controller for the console and cut the other 2. Magnavox configured the machine to now accept individual game cards that modified the console circuitry, making it the first console with interchangeable games. They were calling it the Skillovision during testing, but then later marketed it as the Magnavox Odyssey that we know today. The rifle game was then later turned into a separately sold add-on game called Shooting Gallery. The device came bundled with all this extra stuff: paper money, playing cards, poker chips, and those beautiful plastic overlays for the screen. And in September of '72, the Magnavox Odyssey hit the market for $99.95, which is just about a whole $1,000 in today's money. The Odyssey was marketed as the new electronic game of the future and the closed-circuit electronic playground. The Odyssey was exclusively sold at Magnavox dealers only. The company had hoped that since this was a new and innovative product, that people would come to their stores specifically for it. They sold approximately 69,000 units, which is about half or so of their originally manufactured stock. Bear was a bit hurt by the high price and felt that it was a big factor for what he thought were low initial sales, but also because Magnavox restricted sales of the device to its dealerships. Some people misleadingly thought that the device only worked with Magnavox televisions. But actually, sales were perfectly in line with the company's projections. After the holiday season, Magnavox had originally planned to discontinue the console anyway, but the continuing demand, along with high customer satisfaction reports from surveys, convinced them to continue stocking it. Now, this was back in the mail order catalog days, and Magnavox published 2 books each year. There was one before Christmas, and another for their annual sale in January. The Odyssey was removed from the '71 pre-Christmas catalog, but it returned later in the '73 January catalog with a whole 2-page spread. In '73, the price was reduced to only $50 if you bought it together with a television. And also in '73, the Odyssey was then released in the UK bundled with some different games than the ones that we got in America. And by '74, they had sold out their initial stock and produced another 27,000 units, while now also selling it in various other countries. And then Magnavox brought the Odyssey to other retailers. You can even find a space for it in the 1974 Sears Wish Book. A total of 28 games, which came on 11 different game cards, were ever released for the Odyssey. The American deal came with a set of 12 games, and other countries got a different set of 10 games, with the other games available for purchase either individually or together in a bundle. And then Shooting Gallery included 4 games on 2 different cards that all used the rifle. Aside from Shooting Gallery, all the rest of the games are more or less the same, because the console doesn't enforce game rules or keep track of scores in any way. You're just meant to use your imagination, together with all this extra stuff, to essentially play board games using your television as a graphical interface. But this was an exciting and novel thing for the early '70s. And before the term had even been coined, the Odyssey lived on as the very first home video game console. Now, after they were done with computer space, our boys from Syzygy began seeking other partners outside of nutting, and approached the pinball manufacturer Bally, who offered them funding if they had left nutting. Bally offered them $4,000 a month for 6 months to design a new pinball machine, as well as a racing video game that the boys had sold them on. They took that deal and hired the computer scientist Al Alcorn as their first design engineer. This time, they wanted to publish a game under their own name. Initially wanting to start things off with that driving game, Bushnell had concerns that it might be too complicated for the new guy's first game. He saw a demonstration of the Magnavox Odyssey, and the tennis game on there gave him an idea. Bushnell asked Alcorn to begin work on an arcade version of that tennis game, which you probably could have guessed by now would become Pong. They liked where this was going, and prepared to offer the game to Bally as a part of their contract. Now at this point, their partnership called Syzygy had never been incorporated, so now was the time to do so. But their name was already taken, as Syzygy is an astronomical term, which means two things that are in conjunction or opposite of each other, such as the sun and the moon, for example. Looking for inspiration for a new name, Bushnell was all about the board game Go, and chose the name Atari, which in the context of Go at least, is a state where a stone, or a group of stones, is imminently in danger of being taken by the opponent, kind of like a check in chess. And in 1972, in Sunnyvale, California, smack in the center of Silicon Valley, a new era reigned in, as Atari became incorporated and raised its logo for the first time. It was the dawn of a golden age. Back at the lab, Al was hard at work. He went and purchased a $75 Hitachi black and white television set from a local store, and fashioned it into a 4-foot wooden cabinet. The prototype impressed the boys so much that they right away wanted to test it in the market. They installed their new game at a local bar called Andy Cap's Tavern. They were cool with the owner, and he let them do their thing. They set their new game up alongside a jukebox, a number of pinball games, and the already known computer space. The game was quite popular in the tavern, and our Atari boys were very excited. After about 2 weeks of testing Pong in the bar, they decided it was time to show corporate. Bushnell demonstrated their game to executives from both Bally and Midway Manufacturing, hoping to offer Pong in place of the 4 promised racing game. A few days later, though, they were experiencing technical difficulties with their prototype, and had to call their boy Al to come up and fix it. But hilariously, the problem had turned out to be that the coin mechanism was just overfilled with quarters. So the Atari boys thought it would be way more profitable to manufacture the game themselves, rather than to license it. But they'd already drawn interest from both Bally and Midway, so Bushnell decided to pull a stunt and tell each of the 2 companies that the other one wasn't interested, so that they would both decline his original offer. He wanted to keep Pong purely for Atari, but not damage his relationships with either company. However, finding financial backing for Pong proved to be incredibly difficult, because banks viewed it as some sort of pinball game, and pinball was still heavily regarded as an icon of crime and corruption. After a long effort, they finally found someone who would fund their operation. They obtained a line of credit from Wells Fargo and used it to build an assembly line. They staffed it with help from the local unemployment office, but just couldn't get enough hands. Their initial manufacture process was also very slow, and it was hard to keep up with the demand for their hot new game. They were only able to produce about 10 cabinets per day, and many of those were failing their quality testing. But after all the trial and tribulation, they did eventually iron out the assembly process, and Pong was hot. It quickly became a household name, and funny enough, it became a part of the dating scene of the time. You see, women generally tend to have better fine motor control than men do, and on average they were better at Pong than men, so it became a popular thing for ladies to hang out around the machine and invite the boys over to play. Pong became a massive hit, and it was getting about 4 times the plays of other coin-operated games from the time. They even made a 4-player doubles version of it. They sold about 8,000 machines by the end of '74, and they went on to make a home version of Pong just a year later in '75. But even before that, right after the release of Pong, they were straight away making new games. Their second game was this one called Gotcha from '73, where 2 players chase each other around the Matrix in a game of tag. It's kind of neat, but it makes this awful noise. They followed that up with another game called Space Race in the same year. You and an opponent each race to the top of the screen while dodging and avoiding the stars, which will kill you. It's a high-score game where you try to get as many laps in as you can within a time limit. And then in '74, they made a sort of driving game, perhaps the one that they had envisioned since the beginning. You drive around a top-down car, actually using a steering wheel and a gas pedal, and you've got a little gear shift too, but it's not as easy as it looks, because there are also oil slicks, which are these very hard to see black boxes against a black screen. So Atari kept on keeping on with their arcade games, and come the mid-'70s, the ban on pinball was finally being lifted. Pretty much everywhere, as pinball machines and their perception had turned more into a purely recreational thing. But also, a lot of courts were deeming the old pinball bans as invalid, because if they were used for gambling, then the pre-existing local gambling laws would already apply to them. And if they were being used to gamble illegally, then that's just blatantly a crime, wholly unrelated to the pinball machines themselves. So Atari opened up a pinball division and started making those too. But Pong gave Atari the success they needed to essentially launch video games as an industry, and the rest is history.